Hello friends, I'm glad you're here tonight. I want to take you into a different kind of story, one that is not about heroes charging forward with rifles raised high, but about the men who walked slowly, silently, and carefully, those who carried no banner, but whose work often decided whether others lived or died. Tonight, we are going to wander through the life of a sapper during the Second World War. Imagine for a moment being one of those men, crawling through the mud, listening for the faintest click under your boot, or tracing a cable through frozen ground in the dark of night. This was not a glamorous role, but it was one of the most dangerous and one of the least talked about. Before we begin, I have a question for you. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? I always find it fascinating to know where people are when they decide to let history guide them towards sleep. Now let's step back in time, into the 1940s, where the world was burning on every continent. The role of a sapper or combat engineer was shaped by the unique demands of each battlefield. In the mud of the Eastern Front, in the deserts of North Africa, or in the hedgerows of France, sappers faced tasks that were both brutally physical and deeply technical. They cleared minefields, built bridges, blew up enemy defenses, and repaired roads under fire. Their hands touched both death and survival, sometimes within the same hour. To walk in their boots was to live with constant tension, because every step might be your last. A soldier carrying a rifle knew the enemy was ahead. A sapper knew the enemy might already be beneath his feet. One of the most terrifying parts of their work was mine clearing. Mines were placed everywhere, along roadsides, in fields, near rivers, and even in the rubble of destroyed villages. Some were anti-tank mines, heavy and metallic, waiting for the weight of a vehicle to crush them. Others were anti-personnel mines, small and sinister, designed to maim rather than kill, leaving soldiers screaming and slowing down the advance. A sapper would often lie flat on his stomach, using a thin probe, sometimes just a bayonet or a stick of metal, pushing carefully into the earth at an angle, listening and feeling for the faint tap of steel. Every movement was slow, every breath measured. If his hand shook, if he moved too fast, he could be gone in an instant. And yet, this was routine work, something done day after day, because armies could not move forward without these men. The training for sappers was intense, but no amount of drilling could fully prepare someone for the chaos of the front. Many were young, barely 20 years old, learning under the eyes of veterans who had already lost friends to hidden explosives. Mistakes were punished not by scolding, but by silence. The kind of silence that followed an explosion when the earth settled back into place and only smoke remained. This was the reality. You might spend hours clearing a single path through a minefield, and still, someone walking behind you could step slightly to the side and never return. Precision was everything, but the battlefield rarely allowed perfect conditions. And yet, life as a sapper was not only about mines. They built pontoon bridges across rivers under artillery fire, hammering and dragging heavy sections into place while shells crashed around them. Imagine the noise of wooden beams slamming together, the splash of water as men shoved floating supports into a river, and above it all the whine of incoming rounds. The bridge had to be completed because tanks and supplies had to cross. Delay was not an option. In those moments, courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of continuing despite it. Meals for these men were often nothing more than cold rations, hardtack biscuits, tins of meat, watery soup. When lucky, they might have hot coffee or a chunk of bread still warm from a field bakery. But food was more than fuel. In the quiet moments after a dangerous task, sitting around a small fire with others, it became a ritual of survival. Stories were told, cigarettes were shared, sometimes songs were whispered in low voices. The laughter, though brief, was a rebellion against the fear that clung to them. What many people don't know is that sappers also created traps of their own. They laid mines to stop enemy tanks, rigged buildings with explosives to collapse when occupied, and sometimes designed deceptive devices that looked harmless but could destroy an unwary soldier. It was a strange balance. One day you were disarming an enemy minefield, the next day you were planting your own. This constant dance with explosives left many men with trembling hands, even years after the war ended. Some would never again walk across a field without scanning the ground ahead of them. Another part of their life was the rumor mill. Soldiers told each other stories, some true, some wildly exaggerated, about new types of mines, about enemy traps that could be triggered by sunlight or by the weight of a single leaf. Most of these were nonsense, but when your life depended on careful attention, you tended to believe even the wildest warnings. Better to be cautious than careless. And so these rumors became part of the daily rhythm, part of the psychology of surviving such a role. If you picture the sapper only as a man crawling in the mud with a probe, you miss the broader picture. They were engineers, problem solvers, men who used both brains and bravery. When bridges were blown up, they figured out how to make replacements with whatever materials were at hand. When roads were blocked, they blasted paths through. When units were trapped, sappers created escape routes. Their work was the skeleton that allowed the body of the army to move, and without them, offensives would grind to a halt. As we continue, I want you to hold in your mind the image of a young sapper, his uniform dirty, his face lined with exhaustion beyond his years, his hands steady even when the ground trembled under artillery fire. This is the man we are walking with through history, and his story is not one of a single battle or a single place, but of countless moments of danger, resilience, and quiet determination. And perhaps as we move forward, you'll notice how the smallest details, what he ate, what he heard at night, how he passed the long hours, become as important as the great battles themselves. The life of a sapper was defined not just by the tasks he performed, but by the constant weight of invisible pressure pressing down on him. Imagine walking with your unit across a muddy field in northern France, where the grass seems innocent, but each step might conceal a device placed by the retreating enemy. Your comrades marched in formation, rifles slung, eyes scanning the horizon for enemy soldiers, while your gaze was fixed downward, every clump of earth a potential death sentence. That endless tension was a kind of warfare of its own, one that slowly wore away at nerves and left men aged far beyond their years. What made their work so heavy was the knowledge that mistakes did not only claim their own lives. A sapper was rarely alone. Behind him came others, infantrymen, supply carriers, even medics, trusting his eyes and his hands to lead them safely. A single miscalculation could mean dozens of casualties. It was not the kind of responsibility you could shrug off, and many who survived the war carried a strange mix of pride and guilt for the rest of their lives. Pride because they had saved countless others, guilt because no matter how skilled you were, no one was perfect and not everyone made it through. At night, after long days of clearing obstacles or laying charges, the camps of engineers were not restful places. The sound of distant artillery shook the ground, and even the rustling of the wind through the grass might sound like the snap of a wire. Many of them found it impossible to sleep deeply. They would lie in their blankets, staring at the stars, whispering quietly to one another about home, about the food they missed, about the things they would do if they survived long enough to see peace. Sleep was light, broken by the sudden flares in the sky or the bark of orders pulling them back into action. Rest was never truly rest. Food, as simple as it might sound, became a highlight of the day. Not because it was particularly good, most of it was not, but because it was one of the few moments where danger felt distant. A thin soup of barley and cabbage, a scrap of sausage, a piece of bread, perhaps hard and stale but dipped into the broth to soften, it was enough to bring a kind of temporary happiness. Sometimes, soldiers would barter cigarettes for extra portions, or share small treasures from care packages if they were lucky enough to receive them. Coffee, though rare on some fronts, was like liquid gold. Even the faint smell of it boiling in a battered tin could draw men closer, reminding them of kitchens far away. One of the most peculiar things about being a sapper was the relationship with sound. These men listened in ways most soldiers did not. They had to recognize the faintest click of a firing mechanism, the hollow echo of a hidden tunnel, the vibration of wires under the soil. Their ears were tuned like instruments, sensitive to every unnatural note in the landscape. Over time, many sappers could tell by instinct when something was wrong, when the silence of a forest hid a trap, or when a road seemed too conveniently clear. That intuition, built from repetition and fear, saved lives again and again. Of course, superstition played its part. Soldiers in every army developed little rituals, but sappers were especially prone to them. Some refused to step with their left foot first when entering a field. Others carried a lucky coin or muttered the same phrase under their breath before beginning work. It may sound foolish now, but in a world where death waited beneath the soil, such habits were anchors of sanity. They gave a sense of control in a place where control barely existed. Despite all the danger, there were moments of strange beauty. Imagine a ruined village, houses shattered, church towers leaning precariously, yet in the midst of it, wildflowers pushing through the rubble. A sapper crawling through the debris, searching for wires, might pause for just a second, noticing a butterfly resting on the edge of a broken wall. In that instant, the war seemed far away, and life, fragile and stubborn, reminded them why they were risking everything. These flashes of humanity gave them strength, even if they were fleeting. When the sappers were ordered to destroy something rather than save it, the experience carried a different weight. Blowing up a bridge was not only about cutting off the enemy, it was about watching the destruction of something built by human hands, something that once served communities, wagons, children walking to school. The thunder of explosives tearing apart stone and steel was thrilling to some, heartbreaking to others. Yet it was necessary because in war, strategy demanded sacrifice, not just of lives, but of the very structures of civilization. There were also darker tasks. Sappers sometimes had to clear corpses from areas where explosives were hidden. The enemy, knowing that soldiers would rush to recover the fallen, occasionally booby-trapped bodies. To approach a comrade lying still, to touch his uniform with trembling fingers, not knowing whether the gesture of respect might trigger a device, that was a cruelty that scarred many men deeply. Even years later, veterans would shiver at the memory, their voices lowering whenever they spoke of such moments. The tools of a sapper were simple yet carried immense weight. A mine probe, a set of pliers, a coil of wire, blocks of TNT, fuses, detonators, and sometimes nothing more than a shovel and bare hands. Each tool was an extension of his survival, and losing one could mean disaster. Some men developed such attachment to their kits that they gave them names, treating them like old friends, because in many ways they were. Tools did not betray, tools did not panic, tools were constant when everything else was chaos. And so, through mud, through forests, through the shattered bones of cities, these men moved forward. Their story is not told in the same way as the storming of beaches or the charge of tanks, but without them, none of those great movements could have happened. Their legacy is one of quiet endurance, invisible victories, and the kind of courage that does not shout but whispers, steady and unbroken. The sapper's world was not only defined by the danger of hidden explosives. There was also the constant backdrop of artillery and small arms fire, the endless thunder that shook the ground and made the air itself feel alive. For many, the strangest part of their work was how it demanded calmness in the midst of noise. While shells landed nearby and rifles cracked across the horizon, a sapper might be kneeling in the mud, slowly twisting the cap off a detonator, his hands steady, his breath unbroken. To survive, he had to create silence within himself, a stillness that ignored the chaos around him. This balance, between fire and silence, was perhaps the hardest lesson to learn. When clearing paths for infantry, sappers often moved at night. Darkness gave some protection from enemy snipers, but it also meant every task had to be done by touch and memory. Imagine crawling on your knees through wet grass, feeling with your fingers for wires strung low between posts, wires that could set off mines or hidden charges. The moon might be bright one night, casting silver light over everything, and the next night clouds would swallow the sky, leaving you blind. In those hours, the senses sharpened unnaturally. The smell of damp earth, the distant barking of dogs in a ruined village, even the sound of your own heartbeat could seem louder than the battlefield itself. Daily routines were strange because there was no real schedule. Some days, work began at dawn with orders to prepare a road for tanks. Other days, an urgent cry would wake the men after barely an hour of sleep. A bridge needed shoring up before vehicles could cross, or enemy mines had been discovered blocking a supply route. Meals came whenever there was time, rest whenever exhaustion forced it. Unlike infantry units that sometimes rotated in and out of the front lines, engineers were needed constantly, and their tasks rarely ended. This relentless pace added a different kind of fatigue, one that gnawed at the mind as much as the body. There were small joys, though hidden in the margins. Letters from home were treasured like gold. A few lines from a wife, a mother, or a friend could brighten an entire week. Photographs passed from hand to hand, men leaning close to look at smiling faces they had never met, offering kind words to the owner. "She's beautiful," or "Your little boy looks just like you." In a world where every day might be your last, those pictures became talismans, proof that something gentle still existed beyond the battlefield. Many sappers tucked them into breast pockets, close to the heart, where they could feel the crinkle of the paper through the fabric of their uniforms. Another part of their experience was the constant improvisation. Manuals might teach how to disarm a mine in perfect conditions, but perfect conditions never existed. Sometimes a fuse was rusted, sometimes a wire was buried too deep to reach, sometimes rain had turned a field into a swamp, sucking at boots and tools alike. In such cases, a sapper had to rely on instinct, making split-second decisions that could not be rehearsed. Creativity, in those moments, was as important as discipline. Many veterans would later say that luck favored the clever, those who could think quickly when the manual had no answer. Entertainment came in surprising forms. A harmonica, carried in a pocket, could transform a gloomy night into something bearable. A game of cards, played on a blanket spread over the ground, might last only a few minutes before orders interrupted, but those few minutes were priceless. Sometimes men told jokes, dark humor about their work. They would laugh about carrying enough explosives on their backs to blow up half the countryside, or about the absurdity of being asked to build a bridge with materials that barely held together. Humor was a shield, and though it sounded strange to outsiders, it kept despair at bay. But there were also the nightmares, both waking and sleeping. Dreams of explosions snapping men apart, of fields littered with broken bodies, of the sharp metallic click under a boot followed by nothingness. These haunted many long after the war. Even while awake, sudden sounds could trigger panic. A hammer striking metal, a door slamming shut, a child's toy snapping. These could send a veteran's heart racing, sweat pouring down his face as memory dragged him back into the mud. The war ended, but for sappers, it often never truly ended. The bond among engineers was powerful, forged by the nature of their tasks. They depended on one another in ways that went beyond normal camaraderie. If you were probing a mine, the man beside you was watching, ready to step in if your nerve faltered. If you were laying charges under fire, he held the other end of the rope, steadying you as bullets whipped overhead. That trust became unshakable, and many friendships formed in those moments lasted a lifetime. Men who might never have met in civilian life became closer than brothers because survival demanded it. There was also the strange reality that many sappers rarely fired their own weapons. They carried rifles, of course, but their hands were so often filled with tools, wires, or explosives that they seldom engaged directly in combat. Yet they were always at the heart of it, crawling ahead of infantry, building under fire, destroying obstacles in plain sight of the enemy. They were warriors of a different kind, fighting not by pulling triggers but by shaping the very ground of the battlefield. Their courage was quiet, but it was courage all the same. And so, through shifting seasons, through snow and mud and dust, the work continued. A sapper might one day build a bridge across a river glinting in the morning sun, and the next night he might creep through darkness, his face inches from the soil, listening for the faint sound of death beneath him. It was a rhythm of contrasts, the roar of explosions, the silence of careful probing, the laughter of shared meals, the grief of sudden loss, the destruction of old roads, the building of new paths. In all of it, the sapper moved forward, step by careful step, carrying the invisible weight of a role that held the lives of many in its hands. The soil itself became both enemy and companion for the sapper. Every field, every road, every forest path was alive with secrets hidden beneath its surface. To most soldiers, the ground was simply something to march over, but to a sapper it was a living map of danger. The way grass bent, the pattern of stones, even the softness of the mud, all of it might tell a story. They learned to read the land like a book, searching for lines that didn't fit, shadows that suggested a hand had dug there recently, or patches where the earth seemed just slightly disturbed. Their eyes were always searching, their minds always calculating. Sometimes the ground betrayed them. Mines could shift with rain, moving deeper or closer to the surface. Frost could freeze a fuse solid, only to thaw later and explode at the faintest touch. In the desert, sandstorms buried explosives so deeply that no sign remained until a boot pressed down. It was as though the earth itself was conspiring against them, hiding weapons in its chest and releasing them without warning. And yet, despite this hostility, the same soil provided cover, trenches, and places to hide charges meant to halt advancing enemies. The Sapper's relationship with the earth was one of constant tension, half hatred and half dependence. Every day carried small rituals of preparation. A Sapper's hands were checked again and again, nails kept short, fingers cleaned as best as possible even in mud, because dirt under fingernails could make delicate tasks more dangerous. Tools were laid out in careful order: probe, pliers, cutters, detonators. The placement of each item mattered, because when time was short and nerves were stretched thin, fumbling for the wrong tool could be fatal. Some men arranged their kits obsessively, always in the same pattern, refusing to let anyone else touch them. Order was a form of defense against the chaos of war. The stories of near misses traveled quickly through units. A man who found an explosive by pure instinct, a mine that failed to go off despite being stepped on, a wire cut at the last possible second. These tales became part of the shared folklore, repeated around fires and in dugouts. They were half warnings, half encouragement, proof that survival was possible even in the most impossible moments. But just as often, the stories ended differently. Someone leaned a little too hard, someone ignored a sign, someone grew careless. Then the silence after the blast would settle heavy, and men would speak less for days afterward, as though words themselves might trigger something hidden in the ground. Even in the midst of war, the human body demanded attention. Sappers fought not only the enemy but also exhaustion, hunger, and sickness. Working bent over for hours strained backs and knees. Cold seeped into joints, leaving fingers numb just when precision mattered most. In winter, gloves were often stripped off because they dulled the sense of touch, forcing men to work with bare hands until the skin cracked and bled. In summer, sweat stung their eyes as they crawled under a merciless sun, metal tools growing hot enough to burn. Yet the tasks continued, because stopping meant halting entire armies. Pain became background noise, as constant as the distant guns. Occasionally, a task would bring unexpected quiet. When building fortifications behind the lines, stacking sandbags, or laying out barbed wire, the tension was less, though danger was never absent. These moments offered a strange kind of peace, because hands were busy, but minds could wander. Men would hum to themselves, swap jokes, or argue about football matches they hadn't seen in years. The normality of conversation set against the backdrop of war was almost surreal, as though for a short while they had stepped outside the madness. But even these tasks carried risks, for aircraft might swoop overhead, or artillery could fall suddenly, scattering men and sandbags alike. One of the hardest parts was the lack of recognition. Infantry earned medals for bravery in charges, pilots were celebrated for daring dogfights, but the sappers' victories were often invisible. Clearing a path through a minefield left no trace, yet it saved dozens of lives. Building a bridge that held through a night of shelling was rarely mentioned in reports, though it allowed entire divisions to advance. Many sappers accepted this quiet anonymity, but it stung nonetheless. They joked about being ghosts, unseen but always present, carrying the war on their backs without anyone noticing. Despite that, they found pride in one another's eyes. When a sapper finished clearing a field and waved a column forward, the grateful nods of infantrymen marching safely through meant more than any medal. That silent acknowledgement, that they trusted you with their lives, was reward enough. For many veterans, those nods remained the clearest memories, stronger even than the sound of explosions. Of course, there were moments when their own work turned against them. Mines laid in haste sometimes remained forgotten, only to threaten their own comrades weeks later. Records could be lost, markings destroyed by weather or shellfire. Clearing your own minefield was a bitter task, knowing that your hands had planted the danger in the first place. Yet it had to be done, and it was done without complaint, for war cared little for irony. Nighttime often brought strange encounters. Moving ahead of units, sappers sometimes stumbled into enemy patrols while crawling on their bellies. Exchanges were brief and violent. Knives, pistols, whispered curses in the dark. More often, both sides froze, neither wishing to draw attention, and slipped away silently into the night. In those moments, men saw each other not as faceless enemies but as shadows caught in the same web of survival, each dreading the traps laid by the other. It was a reminder that even in war, humanity flickered, fragile but undeniable. And always, the work continued. Bridges rose from rivers, paths were carved through forests, roads patched with whatever materials could be scavenged. Explosives roared, not only destroying but also shaping the battlefield to suit the needs of advancing armies. The sapper walked at the intersection of creation and destruction, hands skilled in both saving and undoing. His life was lived on that knife edge, where one mistake could end everything, but one success could change the course of a battle. Step by careful step, day by weary day, he carried that burden forward. One of the most remarkable qualities of sappers was their ability to live in a constant state of contradiction. On one hand, they carried the knowledge of how to build, how to repair, how to make things stand strong. On the other, they became experts in destruction, knowing precisely where to place explosives to bring down bridges, bunkers, or buildings. They were both protectors and destroyers, carrying in their pockets the tools to save lives and the tools to end them. This duality defined them, shaping their minds as much as the war itself shaped their bodies. When armies advanced, sappers were often the first to step forward, crouching in the shadows, their boots sinking into unfamiliar terrain. A road might look passable, but experience taught them that if it looked too easy, it was rarely safe. Many times they halted entire columns with a raised hand, kneeling to examine some nearly invisible sign. A faint groove where a wire had been dragged, a patch of earth that seemed just a shade too loose. Those gestures, small and silent, meant the difference between life and sudden catastrophe. The soldiers behind them learned to trust that raised hand more than any shouted command. There were moments when the weight of this responsibility pressed heavier than the explosives on their backs. Imagine kneeling in a field, the sound of boots approaching behind you, dozens of men depending on your judgment, your eyes scanning the soil while every heartbeat pounds like a hammer in your chest. You knew that a single miscalculation could send steel fragments slicing through the air, ending the lives of those who trusted you most. And yet, hesitation was not an option. To freeze meant to delay, and delay could cost the battle. It was a cruel kind of leadership, one that gave no medals and demanded absolute precision. For many sappers, the harshest battles were fought in their own minds. They lived with constant fear, but they also lived with the need to mask it. To show trembling hands would shake the confidence of others. To let fear show in your eyes could make comrades doubt the safety of their steps. So they became experts at hiding their terror, at speaking calmly even while their hearts raced, at cracking jokes with dry lips while sweat ran down their faces. Fear never left them, but it was buried under layers of discipline and duty, as carefully hidden as the mines they uncovered. Their meals, when they came, were often hurried, eaten with fingers still dirty from the soil. A piece of bread, a tin of beans, a slice of salted meat, it was fuel, not comfort. And yet, in those brief moments of eating, the war softened slightly. Men teased each other about table manners, swapped tiny portions to break the monotony, or heated food over small fires that filled the air with a smell more human than gunpowder. The sound of spoons scraping against tins could be strangely soothing, almost like music, a reminder that life went on even in the heart of destruction. When they did rest, it was often in ruined houses, their bodies stretched on cold floors, helmets for pillows, rifles within reach. The walls around them were cracked and broken, windows shattered, roofs half gone. Yet those ruins felt safer than the open air, offering the illusion of shelter. Sometimes they found remnants of civilian life, a child's toy, a book left behind, a family photograph. Those objects, fragile survivors of chaos, sparked quiet conversations. Who were these people? Where had they gone? Were they alive? The men speculated in whispers, weaving imagined stories around the strangers who once lived there. It was a way of connecting to something beyond the battlefield, of remembering that the world had once been ordinary. Danger was not limited to mines alone. Sappers also dismantled booby traps left in houses, barns, and cellars. A door rigged with a grenade, a chair wired to explode when moved, even a bottle left on a shelf with a hidden charge inside. These were the nightmares they faced. Entering a building was never casual. Every object had to be examined, every shadow suspected. The cruelty of such traps left deep scars, because they transformed everyday objects into instruments of death. To drink from a cup, to sit on a chair, to open a door, simple acts of normal life became acts of bravery. And yet, despite the constant danger, there were glimpses of resilience that no amount of fear could crush. In stolen hours, men wrote letters by candlelight, their words shaky but full of longing. Some scribbled poetry, some drew crude sketches of landscapes or faces from memory. Others carved small figures out of wood, carrying them like charms. These acts were fragile rebellions against despair, proof that even surrounded by destruction, the human spirit sought creation. To build something, even a simple drawing, was to defy the endless cycle of blowing things apart. The sappers' training never truly ended, because every battlefield brought new surprises. Enemies designed new traps, new explosives, new ways to hide death in plain sight. Manuals grew outdated almost as soon as they were printed. Veterans taught newcomers by showing, not telling, guiding their hands through the motions of cutting wires or disarming fuses. These lessons were direct, personal, and unforgettable, etched into memory by the knowledge that one mistake would be the last. In this way, knowledge was passed like a torch, keeping men alive one generation of soldiers at a time. Above all, the sapper lived in a world where patience was not just a virtue but a necessity. Each task demanded slowness, precision, calmness. The war moved at a brutal pace, but the sapper had to slow down, to move against the current, to resist the urge to rush. Patience became survival, and survival became habit. Even long after the war, veterans carried this with them, walking slowly, carefully, as though the ground beneath their feet might still hold secrets. For them, the battlefield never truly ended. It stretched into every step of their lives. The days of a sapper were often marked by silence, broken only by the distant echo of artillery or the sudden crack of a rifle. Yet, in between these bursts of violence, there was a strange monotony, a kind of waiting that stretched endlessly, pressing on the nerves. Many men describe the work as a constant balance between extreme focus and long hours of dull repetition. Imagine spending hours clearing a patch of ground, slowly crawling forward, feeling every inch with a bayonet or a probe, while knowing that the smallest mistake could mean the end. It was not just the work itself, but the weight of that thought pressing on their minds that made each day exhausting in ways that food or sleep could never fully repair. Meals, when they came, were often rushed and plain, but to a sapper they were more than food, they were anchors to normal life. A piece of black bread, perhaps hard and stale, dipped into a thin broth, sometimes flavored only by cabbage or a sliver of meat. Cigarettes were shared with reverence, the smoke calming shaking hands after a tense operation. There was even a superstition among some units that lighting a cigarette too quickly after finishing a job was bad luck, as though the explosion had followed you back and was just waiting to strike again. Small rituals like this gave them a sense of control in a world where so much was decided by chance. At night, when darkness fell over the trenches, the sappers became shadows themselves. It was under the cover of night that much of their most dangerous work was done. Crawling into no man's land, carrying heavy satchels of explosives, listening for the faint click of a tripwire or the quiet hum of enemy patrols nearby. They often had to work by touch alone, fingers tracing the cold steel of a mine, loosening the earth around it, removing the detonator, and easing it free without a sound. Some men swore they could hear the mines breathing, as if the machines themselves were alive and waiting for a mistake. Others joked about it, because humor was the only way to keep the fear at bay. But there was more to their lives than mines and wire. In the rare lulls, they carved small wooden figures, played cards with scraps of paper, or sang songs in low voices, just enough to keep spirits from sinking. Letters from home were passed around like treasures, and often read aloud, so that one man's words of love or longing could remind the whole unit of why they endured what they did. A sapper's hands, so steady when disarming explosives, often trembled when unfolding a letter written in a familiar hand. The words could bring tears faster than any bomb. The camaraderie among sappers was unlike that in many other units. They trusted each other with their lives in the most literal sense. If one man lost focus, the whole team might suffer, so they learned to read each other's silences, to know when to crack a joke, when to give space, and when to step in. Friendships were forged in the quiet moments between tasks, and grief was shared in equal measure when someone did not return from a mission. There was no time for long mourning, yet memories lingered, carried like the weight of their equipment, never fully set down. And then there were the rumors. Stories traveled quickly in the war, tales of new types of mines that could sense footsteps, or of entire fields left cursed after a failed detonation. Some claimed the enemy had sappers who could crawl like snakes, unseen in the dark, cutting wires with their teeth. These stories, half truth and half invention, spread around the campfires, filling the long nights with a mix of fear and fascination. Even those who knew better found themselves listening intently, because in the silence of the battlefield, the mind reached for anything to fill the void. What kept them going was not only duty, but the knowledge that each mine cleared, each path opened, meant lives saved. The infantry could advance safely, supply lines could stay open, and villages could be freed from the hidden dangers buried beneath their soil. That thought gave meaning to the endless hours, to the dirt under their nails, and the ringing in their ears after a controlled blast. It was not glory they sought, but survival, and perhaps a small mark left on the war, invisible to most, but vital all the same. Nightfall brought a different kind of terror, one that daylight could never produce. Darkness was both a shield and a trap, a canvas for imagination and for death alike. Sappers often moved under a moonless sky, carrying only the faint glow of a lantern or the dim reflection of a watch face to guide them. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. Even the sound of their own heartbeat could seem deafening, each thump a reminder of fragility. The world contracted to the space beneath their hands and the faint outline of the earth before them, a narrow path through a field of hidden threats. During these hours, the mind sharpened, but also grew restless. Shadows stretched and twisted in the corners of vision, and sometimes the trees or ruins seemed to sway with a life of their own. Some men swore they could see the enemy moving silently, a figure that vanished when attention focused directly. Others imagined whispers carried by the wind, faint voices that played tricks on ears already tuned to the softest sound. Sleep-deprived and tense, sappers had to rely on training, instinct, and sheer force of will to complete their tasks without succumbing to the illusions of night. Crawling across frozen fields, a sapper might brush past the remnants of past battles. A rusted helmet, a fragment of uniform, a bone half buried in the soil. Each relic was a grim reminder of what had come before, and what could happen again. There was a peculiar reverence in these moments, as if touching history, feeling the weight of countless lives absorbed into the ground. Some men paused to mark a fallen comrade's gear or add a small stone, a quiet ritual of respect amid the chaos. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning in a world dominated by destruction. Operations at night were meticulously planned, yet always vulnerable to unexpected events. A snapping twig could betray their position, a distant dog barking could set enemy patrols on alert, a sudden gust of wind might scatter tools or papers with schematics. Every task was approached like a ritual. Probing for mines, loosening soil around hidden charges, connecting wires, and cutting fuses, all had to be done with precision and complete awareness. A lapse, no matter how brief, could transform a routine mission into a tragedy. There were moments when the work demanded an almost superhuman patience. Disarming a mine could take an hour or more, fingers tracing invisible lines, tools held steady despite numbness, muscles screaming from awkward positions. Some mines were clever, rigged with anti-tamper devices meant to punish any interference. Others had been buried for weeks, soil and water making mechanisms unpredictable. Veterans developed a sixth sense, an intuition honed by repeated exposure, but even the most skilled could not rely on luck alone. Every operation was an exercise in respect for the invisible forces beneath the ground. Yet amidst the tension, life persisted in small ways. A soft hoot from an owl, the shimmer of dew on grass, or the faint distant glow of a village window offered brief moments of calm. Sappers sometimes whispered jokes to each other, not to mock the danger, but to anchor themselves to human normality. Humor, even the darkest, was a weapon against fear, a fragile shield against the relentless pressure of the night. And when a particularly dangerous operation ended without incident, a quiet sigh of relief spread through the team, a subtle, unspoken celebration of survival. Sleep, when it came, was never deep. Blankets on cold floors or under open skies could barely protect from the chill, and the mind remained alert, listening for signs of danger. Dreams mingled with reality, and many men woke in panic, convinced they had stepped on a hidden explosive or that a patrol had found them. Even after the war, this hyper-awareness lingered, a permanent echo of the nights spent balancing life against unseen death. And yet, there was a strange beauty in the night. The battlefield, silent for a few hours, revealed details invisible in the chaos of day. Stars reflected in puddles of rainwater, broken buildings casting long shadows, the faint outlines of hills and forests appearing like a landscape drawn by imagination. In these moments, a sapper could see not only the danger but also the resilience of the land itself, the way life, however fragile, pushed forward despite human conflict. It was this combination of peril and wonder that defined the nocturnal world of a sapper, a place where death and life coexisted in stark relief, demanding every ounce of skill, patience, and courage. Every dawn, when the first light hit the horizon, the sappers would rise from their cold, restless nights and prepare for another day. They carried the weight of what they had survived, the relief of what had gone right, and the memory of what had gone wrong. Each sunrise was both a gift and a reminder that the work would never truly end. The night left its mark on them, shaping not only their actions but their minds, a shadow lingering long after the bombs had ceased and the war had moved on. Not all threats came from the obvious sources of war. While mines and explosives demanded constant attention, there were countless subtler dangers that tested a sapper's endurance. Disease could spread silently through camps, brought by contaminated water or spoiled rations. Typhus, dysentery, or trench foot were as much enemies as bullets or shells. A sapper might spend hours wading through waterlogged trenches, feeling his boots fill with icy liquid, knowing that a few more minutes of exposure could cripple him. And yet, there was no time to complain. Every minute counted, and any pause could risk the safety of those depending on his skills. Supply lines were a constant concern. Rations might run low, and while soldiers and other units sometimes received fresh food or even treats, the sapper often had to make do with what could be carried. A piece of hard bread, a tin of meat, perhaps a few potatoes boiled in whatever water was available. These simple meals were taken quickly, with hands still muddy, knives and spoons improvised from scraps. Men would trade portions if one had slightly more, sharing food as though it were a precious commodity, which in a way it was. The camaraderie around these meals helped maintain morale, even as the world outside remained perilous. Weather, too, was a constant adversary. Rain could turn fields into quagmires, making the soil cling to boots and tools alike. Snow could bury markers, obscure paths, or freeze explosives into unpredictable shapes. Winds carried sounds and smells, masking dangers or amplifying them, while sunlight could reveal positions to the enemy. Sappers learned to read clouds, temperature changes, and subtle shifts in the environment, all while balancing the primary focus on their deadly tasks. The battlefield was never static, and every new day brought its own challenges. Animals, surprisingly, also played a role. Dogs, birds, even rats could give away a hidden mine or tripwire. A rustle in the grass might be a harmless fox, or it might signal something far more lethal. Sappers became keenly attuned to these signals, interpreting movement and sound with near-supernatural precision. At the same time, small moments of connection with wildlife offered a rare distraction. Spotting a fox dart through the ruins, or hearing a nightingale sing in the distance, reminded them that life persisted, fragile but insistent, even amidst the destruction. In addition to these daily hardships, there was the emotional weight carried by witnessing the aftermath of battles. Roads cleared of mines sometimes revealed the devastation left behind. Overturned carts, shattered homes, discarded belongings. Occasionally, sappers found bodies long buried by rubble, reminders of both the cruelty of war and the fleeting nature of survival. For those who had narrowly avoided death themselves, these encounters reinforced a mixture of relief and survivor's guilt, emotions that would linger for years after the fighting ended. Despite the constant strain, sappers maintained a network of small pleasures. Cards and dice games were improvised from scraps of paper or wood, and the winner of a round might earn a morsel of food or a cigarette. Jokes, often dark and cynical, were exchanged quietly around makeshift fires, offering a fragile shield against despair. Music, when possible, lifted spirits. A harmonica or an old guitar brought a moment of normalcy, a reminder of life outside the battlefield. These moments, though brief, were crucial, sustaining morale and offering a psychological reprieve from the relentless tension. One of the more overlooked aspects of a sapper's life was their meticulous attention to record-keeping. Every mine laid, every path cleared, every explosive removed was noted carefully. Maps were marked with invisible or coded symbols, ensuring that others could follow safely. Losing these records could be catastrophic, leading to casualties among both friendly troops and civilians. Discipline in documentation became as vital as skill in handling explosives, for without it, experience alone was insufficient to guarantee safety. Even in times when enemy activity was low, a sapper's vigilance never wavered. Quiet moments were deceptive, lulling men into a false sense of security. A small slip, misjudging a buried wire, underestimating the stability of soil, or ignoring a faint, unusual sound, could transform peace into disaster in an instant. Training, instinct, and constant practice were the only buffers against these sudden, invisible threats. For sappers, the battlefield extended far beyond open firefights. It was embedded in every inch of earth, in every shadow, in every sound. And yet, the persistence of these men was remarkable. They carried explosives, tools, and an almost unbearable responsibility across fields, forests, and ruined towns, guided by nerves of steel, keen observation, and the faint hope of surviving another day. Each successful operation, each cleared path, was a silent victory, unseen by most but vital to the broader war effort. Step by cautious step, they continued, balancing between life and death, between duty and fear, between chaos and the fragile order they could impose on the land. Every sapper quickly learned that no plan survived first contact with reality. Manuals offered guidance, but the battlefield constantly demanded improvisation. A fuse might be corroded, soil too hard to dig without cracking the casing, a wire frayed beyond recognition. Nothing ever went exactly as expected. In these moments, skill was not enough. Creativity became essential. A sapper might use a bent bayonet to probe deep into the earth, fashion a makeshift clamp from broken scraps of metal, or rig a small lever from branches and rope to move a heavy charge without touching it directly. Every improvisation carried enormous risk, but without it, progress was impossible. Experience became intuition. A veteran could sense the tension in a wire, feel the subtle resistance under a probe, or hear the difference in the sound of soil shifting around a buried device. New recruits learned to watch the older men, observing how they moved their hands, how they adjusted their breathing, how they seemed to slow the world down to match their own focus. Mistakes were unforgiving, yet in each success, the men found not only relief but pride. The quiet knowledge that they had shaped outcomes through ingenuity, that cleverness and calm could bend even the chaos of war. Even mundane tools took on a different life in the hands of a sapper. Wire cutters, probes, pliers, shovels, all became extensions of the body, instruments wielded with delicate precision. Improvised tools were just as vital. A broken rifle stock could become a lever, a piece of tin could shield a fuse from rain, a leather strap might secure a charge that otherwise would have slipped. Everything had a potential use, and nothing could be wasted. The battlefield became a workshop of necessity, where danger and invention were inseparable. The psychological dimension of their work was just as demanding as the physical. While soldiers might respond to visible threats with instinctive aggression, sappers had to cultivate patience and calm. Every nerve had to be steady, every thought controlled. Fear had to be recognized but never acted upon, anxiety noted but compartmentalized. Some men whispered prayers, others hummed tunes under their breath. A few even told themselves stories aloud to maintain focus. Every tactic served one goal: to survive long enough to complete the task and ensure the safety of others. Sleep deprivation was relentless. Long hours spent kneeling in mud, crawling through fields, or holding explosives in precarious positions meant that exhaustion never fully dissipated. Men sometimes drifted into microsleeps, only to snap awake at the faintest sound, heart racing. Maintaining vigilance under these conditions demanded more than discipline. It demanded habit. Sappers developed routines, mental checklists repeated until they became automatic. Each step of probing, disarming, and clearing became ingrained, a rhythm that allowed the mind to function even when the body was failing. Weather compounded every challenge. Rain turned soil into a thick, sticky trap. Frost cracked hands and froze mechanisms. Mud sucked at boots, tools, and bodies alike. Even heat was dangerous, warping metal and exhausting men, causing dehydration that dulled concentration. The environment was never a passive backdrop. It was an active participant, unpredictable and often hostile. Yet adapting to these conditions was part of the craft. A sapper learned to use the wind to mask movement, the shadows to obscure themselves, the rain to hide their presence. Each natural factor became both an obstacle and a potential ally. Comradeship was critical in this world. Sappers relied on each other not only for technical skill but for emotional stability. A whispered observation, a gentle correction, a quiet warning could save lives. Laughter, rare and often dark, helped to anchor morale, while shared rituals, a cigarette passed between two men, a brief sip of coffee, provided fleeting comfort. Bonds formed under such stress were unbreakable, forged in the knowledge that each man's life depended on the other's skill, judgment, and courage. The unpredictability of their work meant that every day held both routine and crisis. 1 hour, a sapper might be reinforcing a bridge with sandbags and timber, speaking quietly with a comrade about life before the war, noting the distant stars in a moment of peace. The next, he might be crawling on hands and knees over a field riddled with mines, listening intently for the faintest irregularity, knowing that one slip could end his life. This tension between mundane labor and mortal danger defined the profession, a constant oscillation between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Even small successes carried immense emotional weight. Clearing a field, securing a bridge, or disarming a device meant not just tactical advantage but the preservation of dozens of lives. Each accomplishment was quiet but profound, acknowledged in subtle nods or brief smiles, understood fully only by those who had risked everything in similar circumstances. For sappers, these moments of triumph were more meaningful than medals, more satisfying than recognition from distant commanders. Survival, skill, and ingenuity were their currency, and they spent it daily with painstaking care. The work of a sapper was endless, stretching from dawn to dusk, from dusk into the haunted nights, a continuous cycle of danger, innovation, and meticulous labor. Each day was a testament to human resilience, a testament to the ability to face incomprehensible risk with precision, courage, and sometimes a spark of wit. The land was a living enemy, but also a canvas for skill and bravery, where every hand movement, every choice, every improvised tool could turn fate itself. The mind of a sapper was always active, sometimes more dangerous than any mine or wire. Constant vigilance created a strange kind of mental strain, a tightrope walk between focus and obsession. Sleep-deprived, hands raw from work, and constantly aware of unseen hazards, many men developed personal rituals to maintain control over their thoughts and to reassure themselves that they could survive another day. Some would trace invisible lines on the ground before stepping, imagining an unbroken path of safety. Others counted their steps meticulously, or touched each tool in a precise sequence before handling explosives. These small acts, almost superstitious, were not about luck but about rhythm, about creating a predictable pattern in an unpredictable world. Certain routines extended beyond the purely practical. A man might whistle a particular tune when probing a minefield, believing that the sound focused his mind and kept panic at bay. Others carried trinkets from home, a coin, a locket, a scrap of paper with a loved one's handwriting. These objects were handled delicately, almost as talismans, reminders that beyond the chaos there was life and love worth protecting. In some units, older veterans insisted on telling stories in low voices before missions, recounting past operations or family memories, their words serving to steady nerves and anchor focus. The young men absorbed these stories, often repeating them in their own minds during tense moments, a mental scaffolding against fear. Yet the psychological strain was relentless. The knowledge that one misstep could end not only your life but the lives of those marching behind you was always present. Some men developed hypervigilance, noticing the slightest shift in the soil, the faintest glimmer of a wire, or a bird taking flight in an unusual pattern. Others struggled with intrusive thoughts, replaying near misses over and over, wondering what might have happened if their hands had slipped. Nightmares were common, blending reality and memory in terrifying ways, and some men confessed to hearing phantom clicks or imagining the faint hiss of a fuse in moments of rest. Despite the burden, humor remained a vital part of coping. Jokes were often dark, ironic, or absurd, traded in whispers or brief chuckles around small fires. A man might comment on how even a goat wandering through a ruined village seemed to understand the strategic importance of mines. Or they might pretend to give explosives personalities, arguing over which one was in the mood to explode today. The absurdity provided a tiny release valve, allowing the mind to momentarily escape the relentless tension. Laughter, even if brittle, was medicine, helping to maintain sanity in an otherwise merciless environment. Interactions with fellow sappers were layered with silent communication. A raised eyebrow, a hand gesture, or a subtle shift in body position could convey a warning more effectively than words. Trust was absolute and immediate. Hesitation or doubt could cost lives. New recruits learned to read these cues quickly, often relying on intuition honed under pressure. Mistakes were rarely forgiven lightly, yet teaching and guidance remained patient because survival demanded both skill and understanding. The bond forged through shared danger became a lifeline, a psychological anchor that kept men from succumbing to fear entirely. The monotony of waiting was perhaps the cruelest aspect. Hours could pass without movement, each second stretching as the men crouched, probed, and observed. A field might appear peaceful, a forest quiet, a road empty, but every sapper knew that danger could be buried, invisible, waiting silently for the unwary. They filled these hours with observation, silent conversation, or repetitive mental exercises, maintaining readiness without succumbing to anxiety. Each tiny signal in the environment, a shift in shadow, a rustle of leaves, a slight tremor of the ground, was scrutinized as though it carried the weight of life itself. Rations were more than sustenance. They were markers of time and chance. A bite of bread, a sip of water, or a piece of dried meat could be both comfort and a reminder of vulnerability. Sharing these meager portions became a ritual in itself, a reinforcement of solidarity. Cigarettes, when available, were traded not just for pleasure but as symbols of care and mutual reliance. Even in the direst circumstances, these small acts of humanity punctuated the relentless tension, creating moments of connection that reminded men why their work mattered beyond survival. Some sappers developed techniques to calm themselves physically, holding their breath to steady hands, or pressing a thumb against a pulse point to slow racing blood. Others recited prayers or verses silently, using cadence to anchor focus and quiet intrusive thoughts. The combination of these physical, mental, and emotional strategies created a complex defense system, an internal toolkit as critical as any external equipment. In the midst of chaos, a man could rely on these habits to guide him safely through the invisible minefields of both land and mind. Even during brief respites, the awareness never fully faded. The mind remained attuned to sound and motion, anticipating threats even in moments of apparent peace. A sudden clatter, a shifting shadow, or the glint of metal could snap attention back to full alertness instantly. Life as a sapper was a perpetual tension, a delicate balance between vigilance and the rare moments of rest. Yet in that tension, in the constant negotiation with fear, ingenuity, and human connection, sappers carved a way to survive. Step by careful step, decision by precise decision, they walked a line that few could imagine, shaping outcomes in ways both invisible and vital. The sapper's presence on the front lines was both subtle and indispensable, like a thread holding together a fragile tapestry. Infantry might charge forward with the noise of boots and rifles, yet it was the sapper moving quietly ahead, probing, disarming, and mapping the unseen threats, who determined whether that advance would succeed or end in catastrophe. To most soldiers, sappers were ghosts, invisible protectors, their work rarely witnessed, their importance understood only when disaster had been avoided. And in those rare moments when soldiers did see a sapper crouching over a suspected explosive, the relief in their eyes was unmistakable. Missions often began before dawn. Men rose in near silence, assembling gear, checking tools, reviewing mental maps of the terrain. Each step was deliberate. Every sapper knew that haste could mean the difference between life and death, yet efficiency was also crucial. Supplies were loaded onto backpacks, explosives counted and double-checked, and the faintest details memorized. Which paths were safe, where the enemy might have buried traps, where soil shifted strangely or smelled unusual. The first light of morning brought visibility, but also exposure. Shadows lengthened, and the faint glint of wire or metal could give away the sapper's position. Balance between speed and caution was everything. As infantry moved forward, sappers often lagged slightly behind, tasked with ensuring that routes remained clear. In towns reduced to rubble, their work was particularly nerve-wracking. Buildings, partially collapsed, could conceal hidden charges. Doorways, windows, and cellars became potential death traps. A step too far, a misplaced hand, and a carefully rigged explosive could detonate. Some sappers developed the habit of tapping lightly on walls before entering, listening for hollow echoes, feeling vibrations in the ground, a delicate dance between sound, touch, and intuition. Even seasoned veterans never approached these tasks with certainty. Each operation demanded respect, patience, and vigilance. Communication with the infantry was nuanced. Sappers often used hand signals, short whispered words, or gestures to direct movements. A raised hand could halt an entire platoon, and a subtle nod might indicate a safe passage. The infantry learned quickly to trust these cues implicitly. One lapse in attention, one ignored gesture, could transform a cautious advance into a fatal mistake. Sappers became the silent coordinators of life and death, their decisions immediate, practical, and irreversible. Despite the high stakes, moments of humor occasionally surfaced. A comrade might make a sarcastic remark about a particularly aggressive tree, or joke about the absurdity of spending an hour probing a small patch of soil that looked harmless. Such levity was never loud or boisterous. It was whispered, shared quietly to relieve tension without attracting unwanted attention. These tiny sparks of human connection kept men grounded, a reminder that even amid destruction, they were still living, thinking, and feeling. Some missions required crossing open fields, where cover was minimal and visibility to the enemy was high. In these cases, sappers moved slowly, deliberately, often crawling or crouching, every inch of progress painstakingly measured. The ground might look ordinary, but experience had taught that danger could be buried invisibly, hidden beneath a seemingly benign patch of earth or disguised among vegetation. A misjudged step, a careless movement, or a lapse in attention could trigger hidden devices, and every member of the team depended on the sapper's skill to navigate these treacherous spaces. The interplay between infantry and sappers often carried a subtle tension. Infantry soldiers were eager to advance, sometimes impatient with the slow, methodical pace required by the sappers. Yet when an explosion failed to occur thanks to a careful operation, gratitude was immediate and profound. Sappers understood this dynamic, balancing patience, authority, and empathy, guiding the troops safely while recognizing the human urge for progress. Their work demanded not only technical expertise but also psychological insight, an understanding of both terrain and human nature. The aftermath of these missions revealed the quiet heroism of sappers. Paths cleared, bridges rendered safe, villages navigable. They left behind little evidence of their labor, yet the impact was immense. Entire operations could hinge on their expertise. A detonation avoided, a wire cut, a trap disabled could preserve dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives. Recognition from commanders was rare, medals fewer still, yet sappers carried an unspoken pride, grounded in the knowledge that they had shaped events through careful, courageous labor. Even in moments of rest, the front lines demanded awareness. Enemy snipers, patrols, or hidden devices could appear suddenly. A casual conversation, a shared cigarette, or a brief meal was always accompanied by a watchful eye. Every sound, shadow, and movement was interpreted, calculated, and incorporated into the mental map of danger that each sapper carried. Their world was one of perpetual vigilance, a combination of precise skill, intuition, and unbreakable focus. Survival was never guaranteed. It was achieved step by cautious step, moment by exacting moment. The life of a sapper on the front lines was therefore a continuous oscillation between fear and control, between chaos and precision, between the silent heroism of their labor and the unpredictable dangers that surrounded them. Their days were long, exhausting, and often invisible to the world they protected. Yet within every cleared path, every disabled device, and every cautious step lay proof of their extraordinary resilience, ingenuity, and courage. Each operation, no matter how routine it seemed, was a testament to their discipline and to the fragile, extraordinary endurance of the human spirit amidst the devastation of war. Even as sappers moved through bombed-out towns and shattered villages, the presence of civilians added a complicated, fragile dimension to their work. Homes might be abandoned, yet the faint traces of daily life remained. A child's toy half buried in rubble, a scorched photograph clinging to a wall, or a loaf of bread left to mold in a cupboard. Sometimes villagers returned briefly, bringing what little they could carry, only to retreat at the faintest sound of artillery. Sappers learned to navigate not only the land but also these human traces, careful not to disturb or endanger what remained of ordinary life. Their labor often preserved the paths that civilians might one day use, bridges they could cross, streets they could safely navigate, and, in this sense, the sappers' work extended beyond military necessity to quiet acts of preservation. Scavenging became a skill in itself. Supplies were never guaranteed, and sappers often had to make use of what was available in the environment. A piece of scrap metal could reinforce a bridge, old rope might secure equipment, discarded boards could serve as a temporary platform over soft ground. Even small items like a tin can or a broken crate could be repurposed. Every resource had potential, and nothing could be wasted. Ingenuity and careful observation turned scarcity into survival, and those who mastered this skill could move with confidence where others faltered. Food, especially, was an ever-present concern. Fresh supplies were rare, so foraging and careful rationing were essential. A sapper might share a small portion of bread with a comrade or make a hot meal from scavenged vegetables and scraps of meat. Boiling water over a small fire in a ruined kitchen or cooking improvised stews in rusted pots became acts of resilience. These meals, though simple and often repetitive, offered comfort and a fleeting sense of normalcy. The smell of cooking reminded men of home and human life, a sensory anchor against the constant tension of the battlefield. Interactions with local civilians were fraught with complexity. Some were grateful for the protection sappers offered, sometimes assisting by pointing out hidden dangers, abandoned equipment, or unusual terrain features. Others remained cautious, wary of any uniformed figure, unable to distinguish between friend and foe. Sappers had to navigate these social nuances carefully, balancing empathy with operational security. Each encounter required judgment, subtlety, and, at times, negotiation. The smallest misstep could compromise not only safety but also trust, and the consequences could ripple far beyond a single interaction. Even amidst the danger, moments of beauty emerged unexpectedly. A sudden flower blooming amidst rubble, a stray cat weaving between destroyed walls, or a shaft of sunlight illuminating a ruined courtyard could catch a sapper's attention and offer a brief, almost absurd, sense of peace. These tiny fragments of life were fleeting, yet they reminded the men of continuity that the world existed beyond mines, wire, and gunfire. These brief distractions were treasured, quietly acknowledged with a nod, a glance, or even a whispered remark, as small tokens of humanity amid destruction. Daily routines were punctuated by these small events. A quick wash in a nearby stream, a sip of clear water, or the chance to adjust equipment became minor victories. Even mundane activities required mindfulness. Shoes had to be dried, tools sharpened, and explosives stored carefully to avoid accidents. The attention to detail extended to every aspect of life, creating a rhythm that balanced extreme danger with moments of ordinary labor. In a strange way, these repetitive tasks, from tying knots to checking fuses, became meditative, a way to regain a semblance of control. Humor persisted even here, subtle and cautious. Men joked about the absurdity of their conditions, finding a loaf of bread in a deserted house and debating who was lucky enough to eat it, or teasing each other about trips over hidden rubble. Laughter was rarely loud, but it was essential. It reminded them that they were still human, still capable of connection, even in a world dominated by fear and chaos. The humor was often shared quietly, a fragile but persistent defiance against despair. Sappers also had to adapt quickly to new information. A civilian report of a buried explosive, an abandoned building with potential traps, or the sight of suspicious soil required immediate attention. Improvisation, observation, and intuition combined with their technical skills. These moments of interaction and observation were not separate from their work. They were integral, blending the human, environmental, and technical aspects of sapper life into a continuous challenge. Through these interactions, both with people and the environment, sappers maintained their sense of purpose. Every cleared street, every bridge made safe, every warning pass to an infantry unit or civilian reinforced the critical importance of their labor. Their work created not only tactical advantage but also a fragile thread of safety for those navigating the same devastated landscape. The constant oscillation between danger and care, destruction and preservation, fear and humor defined the rhythm of their lives. Some moments on the battlefield demanded more than skill. They demanded instinct, a combination of training, intuition, and pure survival sense. Sappers often faced situations where hesitation could mean death, and decisions had to be made in split seconds. A wire protruding just enough to catch a boot, a faint metallic glint in the soil, or a subtle change in terrain could signal a hidden explosive. The sapper's hand might freeze for a heartbeat, calculating the safest approach, the tiniest adjustment of pressure or angle. These micro-decisions repeated endlessly, each carrying the potential to save or destroy. The unpredictability of the environment ensured that no two operations were alike. One day, a seemingly empty street might conceal multiple anti-personnel devices, each more devious than the last. Another day, a field could appear simple but hide improvised mines, buried with irregular spacing, camouflaged under leaves, soil, and debris. Sappers learned to move methodically, using probing rods, low-light tools, and careful gestures. Even in moments of calm, they remained hyper-aware, scanning, listening, and adjusting constantly. Survival required acute observation, memory, and judgment, all sharpened under relentless pressure. Mistakes were unforgiving. A slip of the hand, a misjudged step, or a misread instruction could lead to explosions, injury, or death. Sappers internalized this reality, developing a mental discipline that allowed them to compartmentalize fear. Panic had to be deferred indefinitely. Focus was everything. Techniques to calm the body became second nature. Slow, controlled breathing, steadying pulses, deliberate hand movements, and visualization of safe procedures. Every motion was purposeful, deliberate, and grounded in the knowledge that any error could be fatal. Sometimes, operations required improvisation under immediate threat. An unanticipated fuse might be triggered by rain, soil shifting, or debris, forcing instant adaptation. A sapper might have to use a piece of timber to brace a device, a bent wire to redirect pressure, or a careful push to stabilize a charge. Each action demanded precision, creativity, and nerve. The mind raced, yet hands moved with practiced calm. The distinction between instinct and learned skill blurred, forming a fluid synergy between observation, decision-making, and action. Noise discipline was crucial. Even the smallest sounds, a dropped tool, a rustle of clothing, or a misstep on debris, could alert nearby enemy forces. Sappers often communicated with subtle gestures, brief glances, or whispered words, ensuring coordination without drawing attention. Every movement was measured, every breath mindful, every decision informed by both technical knowledge and situational awareness. The ability to combine these elements often separated those who survived from those who did not. In these intense moments, sappers experienced a strange duality of awareness. The danger was palpable, immediate, and ever-present, yet a heightened perception emerged. They noticed the texture of soil, the angle of a shadow, the faint reflection of metal, or the barely audible hum of tension in a wire. Sensory perception became almost superhuman, a blend of hyperfocus and anticipation that allowed them to act decisively in situations where any lapse could be fatal. The emotional toll of this constant alertness was immense. Fear was a constant companion, yet it had to be harnessed, controlled, and even ignored at times. Sappers often developed coping mechanisms: whispered encouragement, subtle humor, brief moments of shared ritual, or silent prayers. Each method provided a psychological buffer, a way to manage the weight of responsibility and the ever-present potential for disaster. Even fleeting distractions, a bird taking flight, the sun breaking through clouds, a hint of wind, could offer a tiny relief, grounding them briefly before returning to relentless vigilance. Sappers also observed the reactions of infantry and other units around them. The tension and anxiety in the soldiers' movements, the nervous chatter or cautious glances, reminded the sapper that their role extended beyond personal survival. The work was for others as much as for themselves. Every cleared path, every disabled explosive, every subtle warning passed along contributed to the lives and missions of dozens, sometimes hundreds. This responsibility weighed heavily, shaping not only actions but also the character of men who survived repeated exposure to such high-stakes environments. Even mundane moments were punctuated with intensity. Adjusting straps, checking tools, eating a quick meal, or surveying terrain could not be taken lightly. Each gesture was weighed against risk, each decision measured for consequence. The battlefield was alive with hidden threats, unpredictable terrain, and human volatility. In this context, ordinary tasks became extraordinary exercises in judgment, patience, and courage. Yet, despite the strain, a sapper could find small victories, quiet reassurance, and moments of unexpected relief. Clearing a particularly dangerous field without incident, successfully improvising a solution, or guiding a team safely through a hidden maze of explosives offered profound satisfaction. These were not moments of celebration, but of silent pride, proof that skill, courage, and careful judgment had made the difference. For a sapper, such moments justified the endless tension, the painstaking labor, and the constant awareness of mortality. Days bled into nights with little distinction. The sapper's body and mind endured exhaustion that often seemed limitless. Limbs ached from constant kneeling, crawling, and lifting. Hands were calloused, cracked, and perpetually soiled. Eyes strained from low light and the relentless scanning of soil, debris, and wire. Sleep was a fragile luxury, snatched in brief pockets when the immediate danger seemed to allow it. Even rest was rarely complete. Dreams were invaded by imagined fuses, hissing wires, and the faint click of explosives, while the brain remained tethered to a world of risk. Yet somehow, men endured, pushed by necessity, skill, and the invisible thread of responsibility toward comrades and civilians alike. Despite this unyielding fatigue, moments of joy occasionally punctuated the grueling routine. A small, intact loaf of bread discovered in an abandoned house, a warm cup of diluted coffee, or the laughter of a comrade over a minor mishap became more valuable than any luxury in civilian life. Music, even a few bars hummed under breath, could lift spirits. A shared joke about the absurdity of crawling through mud for hours offered temporary relief from the omnipresent tension. These instances, fleeting yet potent, reminded sappers that beyond survival, small pleasures still existed, sustaining their morale in subtle but essential ways. Camaraderie was the backbone of endurance. Shared danger forged bonds impossible to replicate outside the chaos of war. Trust was absolute, developed in a crucible where hesitation or doubt could mean death. Every whispered instruction, gesture, and nod carried immense weight. A sapper could rely on a comrade to notice what he might miss, to intervene if he faltered, or simply to provide quiet reassurance with a glance. These relationships transcended ordinary friendship. They were rooted in mutual reliance, respect for skill, and the intimate understanding of shared fear. In this network of interdependence, men found not only survival but emotional sustenance. Routine rituals took on amplified importance in this environment. Preparing tools meticulously, checking fuses, tightening straps, and reviewing mental maps were not only practical but provided psychological structure. Even in the chaos of battle or the monotony of waiting, these repeated acts created predictability, a stabilizing rhythm in a world governed by uncertainty. Small personal habits, twirling a coin, touching a keepsake, humming a tune, offered continuity, a tether to the life and identity beyond the battlefield. The physical toll was matched by mental strain. Hyper-awareness of every movement, sound, and shadow demanded unceasing attention. A faint shift in soil, a barely audible click, or a flash of glint could indicate lethal danger. Sappers developed acute sensory perception, noticing details others would overlook, internalizing patterns of danger, and anticipating consequences with precision. Yet even these heightened senses could become sources of stress, as every step required calculation, every moment demanded focus, and the margin for error remained impossibly thin. Meals, rare and simple as they were, became moments of shared humanity. Hard bread, tins of meat, boiled potatoes, and scalding coffee provided nutrition, but they were also symbolic anchors of normalcy. Sharing rations created ritual and reinforced bonds, while the occasional scavenged vegetable or piece of fruit could elevate spirits dramatically. Even in scarcity, these small acts of communal care offered comfort and reassurance, reinforcing that survival was a collective, not solitary, endeavor. The unpredictability of life forced adaptability at every turn. A suddenly spotted enemy patrol, a hidden explosive discovered in a previously cleared path, or a shift in weather could require instant improvisation. Tools became extensions of both body and mind, used creatively to navigate unforeseen challenges. A sapper might repurpose a fragment of timber, fashion a makeshift probe, or adjust a fuse with meticulous care. Every act of adaptation was informed by training, experience, and the silent understanding that error could have fatal consequences. Even brief interactions with civilians carried weight. Villagers returning to salvage belongings, report dangers, or seek assistance reminded sappers of the fragile continuity of life beyond the battlefield. These moments demanded patience, judgment, and empathy as the men balanced operational security with humanity. Observing civilians, listening to whispered advice, or silently noting signs of habitation became integral to survival and success, embedding human awareness into every operation. Through relentless labor, fatigue, improvisation, and camaraderie, sappers carved a fragile rhythm of existence in the chaos of war. Every cleared path, every disarmed device, every moment of vigilance represented a triumph of skill and endurance over uncertainty. Life was measured not in hours or days, but in small victories. A safe passage, a shared joke, a warm meal, a brief sleep, a successfully guided team, a moment of human connection. These were the quiet, invisible triumphs that defined the extraordinary existence of men whose work was unseen yet crucial, dangerous yet precise, exhausting yet profoundly human. Nightfall brought a different kind of tension, a landscape transformed by shadows and uncertainty. Sappers often operated under the cover of darkness, when visibility was limited and every sound carried disproportionate weight. A fallen branch snapping underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the wind, or the faintest glimmer of metal could mean imminent danger. Night missions demanded heightened senses, absolute stillness, and an unbroken focus that tested both body and mind. Sleep-deprived men became reliant on instinct honed through countless days and nights of probing, scanning, and improvising. In enemy territory, the stakes were amplified. The land itself was unfamiliar. Mines and booby traps could be rigged in ways entirely unexpected. Enemy engineers sometimes left devices meant to detonate after the slightest disturbance or camouflage them with debris that seemed innocuous. Sappers moved deliberately, probing every step, using the quietest gestures to indicate safe passages. Mistakes here could be catastrophic, not only for themselves but for entire units relying on their expertise to navigate deadly terrain. The darkness heightened both danger and the sense of isolation, forcing reliance on comrades and internal discipline more than ever. Tools became almost extensions of the body during these operations. Probes, pliers, and knives were handled with exquisite care, every motion controlled and deliberate. Even simple acts like bending a wire, lifting a board, or adjusting a fuse required precision and concentration. Improvisation often became essential. A piece of cloth could muffle movement, a discarded plank might bridge soft ground, and a bent rod could redirect pressure to prevent detonation. Sappers learned to transform available materials into instruments of safety, creativity driven by urgency and necessity. Communication was whispered, gestured, and coded. No unnecessary sound could escape the vigilant ears of the enemy, and even a faint cough might trigger deadly consequences. Signals were subtle. A nod, a flick of the hand, or a brush of fabric could indicate direction or danger. The men developed an almost imperceptible language, a silent conversation that allowed coordination in environments where words could kill. Observing these cues required complete attention, a mental state that blended perception, calculation, and immediate reaction. The psychological strain of night operations was immense. Fear was constant, gnawing at consciousness even when training dictated calm. Every movement was accompanied by the awareness that a single miscalculation could trigger catastrophe. To cope, sappers relied on ritualized mental habits, silently repeating procedures, counting steps, visualizing sequences of actions, or reciting familiar lines in whispers. Humor persisted in small, quiet forms. A comment on the absurdity of crawling over frozen mud, a playful jab at a fellow sapper, but it was always tempered, fleeting, a whisper against the oppressive weight of darkness. Food and water, scarce in daytime, became even more critical at night. Men ate quickly, often in near silence, sharing scraps and conserving energy. Even brief nourishment offered psychological as well as physical sustenance. The warmth of a hot drink or a bite of bread could feel like a small triumph, a defiance of the relentless environment. These small comforts were magnified by the stark contrast of darkness and danger, moments of humanity amidst a world dominated by threat and uncertainty. Fatigue was relentless. Eyes strained against the dim light, muscles cramped from prolonged crouching, and hands numbed by cold or wear. The mind, however, remained active, assessing, predicting, and improvising. Hyperawareness turned the environment into a landscape of subtle cues. The way soil shifted under weight, the way metal reflected the faint moonlight, or the barely audible hum of tension in a wire. Experience became intuition, intuition became instinct, and instinct guided survival in ways that were almost automatic yet always precise. Encounters with the enemy added unpredictability. Patrols, distant gunfire, and the potential for ambush meant that sappers could never fully relax. Yet even amidst such threats, focus had to be maintained. Decisions had to be immediate, whether to divert, freeze, improvise, or retreat. Each action carried consequences that could ripple outward, affecting entire units, civilians, or future operations. These high-stakes decisions tested the very essence of training, courage, and mental discipline. Despite exhaustion, danger, and uncertainty, sappers sometimes experienced moments of clarity and quiet achievement. Clearing a particularly hazardous stretch, detecting and disarming a cleverly hidden device, or guiding a unit safely through a treacherous area offered profound satisfaction. These accomplishments were rarely celebrated aloud but resonated deeply within the men. Each success affirmed skill, courage, and endurance, small victories in a landscape defined by constant threat. Night operations illustrated the essence of Sapper life: relentless tension, continuous vigilance, ingenuity in action, and quiet heroism. The darkness demanded adaptation, precision, and resilience, pushing men to rely on their skills, instincts, and bonds with comrades. Life became a series of calculated risks, split-second decisions, and small triumphs, each shaping survival in a world where one misstep could erase everything. Ambushes were a constant, lurking threat, shaping every movement and decision. Sappers rarely knew when or where danger might strike. A seemingly empty street could conceal enemy patrols, improvised traps, or cleverly disguised explosives. In these moments, improvisation became essential, a skill honed through experience, intuition, and rapid problem-solving. A fallen beam could serve as cover, a small trench improvised to provide stability, and a bent rod redirected pressure to prevent detonation. Every action was precise, calculated, and executed under immense pressure. Mistakes were unforgiving, consequences immediate, and success depended on a blend of courage and meticulous reasoning. The sensory experience of such ambushes was intense and disorienting. Every sound was amplified. The faintest footstep, the whisper of wind through broken branches, or the subtle vibration of soil could signal imminent danger. Light and shadow played tricks on perception, turning ordinary debris into potential threats. Sappers trained themselves to filter irrelevant stimuli, focusing on patterns that indicated danger while ignoring distractions that might trigger unnecessary panic. This heightened awareness extended to all senses, creating an almost hyper-real perception of the environment. Communication in these scenarios relied entirely on subtle cues. Hand gestures, eye movements, or a slight shift in body posture could signal immediate threats or necessary actions. A whispered warning might mean the difference between life and death. Each team member had to anticipate the other's reactions, often acting on intuition formed from long hours of joint operations. This silent coordination was a form of trust forged in danger, an unspoken bond that allowed men to function seamlessly under extreme stress. Amidst the relentless tension, small moments of reflection emerged. A brief pause behind cover might reveal the eerie beauty of a moonlit street, the quiet sway of trees, or the reflection of starlight on shattered windows. These moments, fleeting and often unacknowledged, allowed sappers to reconnect with their humanity, providing a fragile psychological reprieve from constant danger. The contrast between the serenity of nature and the lethal environment heightened the surreal experience of war, creating a cognitive dissonance that men learned to navigate. Improvisation often required combining technical knowledge with creative thinking. A misaligned fuse, an unstable wire, or an unexpected obstacle could demand immediate adaptation. Sappers would use fragments of debris, makeshift tools, or altered techniques to stabilize situations, relying on a deep understanding of explosives, physics, and material behavior. Each improvised solution was a test of skill and nerve, a demonstration of human ingenuity under extreme constraints. Success reinforced confidence. Failure could be fatal. Humor, though subtle, persisted even in the midst of ambushes. A whispered quip about an oddly shaped mine, a sarcastic comment about a misbehaving tool, or a quiet joke about the absurdity of the situation provided brief psychological relief. These moments were never loud, never drawn out. They were private, shared in the blink of an eye, yet they offered a crucial counterbalance to fear. Laughter, even fleeting, reaffirmed camaraderie and humanity. Physical exhaustion compounded the psychological strain. Extended operations meant muscles cramped, joints ached, and the body ached with fatigue. Yet the mind had to remain alert, anticipating threats, calculating risks, and maintaining delicate motor control. Sappers developed remarkable endurance, both mental and physical, balancing fatigue with the necessity of precision. Training, routine, and habit supported this balance, creating a rhythm that allowed survival under extreme conditions. Interactions with infantry or other units added further complexity. Miscommunication could prove deadly. Coordination was vital. Sappers needed to guide movements, signal hazards, and ensure the safety of others while managing their own risk. This dual responsibility reinforced the mental load, requiring constant vigilance and adaptability. Yet it also reinforced purpose. The knowledge that their actions protected dozens of lives provided motivation, discipline, and resilience. The environment itself was a teacher. Muddy streets, shattered buildings, and open fields conveyed lessons in patience, observation, and anticipation. Each landscape required unique techniques, awareness, and strategies. Sappers learned to read subtle cues, soil density, leaf patterns, or small disturbances that might indicate hidden dangers. This intimate understanding of the terrain became both a survival mechanism and a source of professional pride. Even amidst extreme danger, men sought connection, whether through brief gestures of reassurance, shared tools, or whispered encouragement. These bonds were not just functional, they were emotional anchors, sustaining morale, focus, and cohesion. Every interaction, however fleeting, contributed to resilience, enabling sappers to endure what might otherwise have been unbearable isolation or fear. Ambushes, improvisation, and moments of reflection illustrated the delicate balance of life as a sapper, constant danger tempered by skill, vigilance reinforced by camaraderie, and fear mitigated by discipline and ingenuity. Each operation was an intricate dance of risk, survival, and human perseverance, a microcosm of the extraordinary endurance required to navigate a world where one mistake could erase everything. Weather was as relentless a foe as the enemy. Sappers moved through rain, mud, snow, wind, and bone-chilling cold, each condition transforming the landscape and complicating every action. Rain turned fields into quagmires, concealing hidden mines and slowing every step. Snow masked devices beneath a pristine white surface, created treacherous footing, and drained the body of warmth and energy. Cold numbed fingers, making delicate manipulations of wires and fuses even more challenging. Heat, conversely, drained stamina, dehydrated bodies, and dulled attention. Each element demanded constant adaptation, turning the environment itself into an opponent to be understood and respected. In rain-soaked trenches or ruined buildings, water seeped into clothes and boots, chilling the body and amplifying fatigue. Fingers stiffened, tools became slippery, and the smallest motion required concentration and care. Men developed techniques to cope, layering clothing, improvising covers with scraps of fabric, and carefully timing movements to minimize exposure. Even mundane tasks, opening a crate, adjusting a fuse, or moving equipment, became exercises in endurance, patience, and precision. The weather dictated rhythm, pace, and strategy, and mastery of adaptation often determined survival. Snow introduced a different set of challenges. Sappers could move cautiously, leaving subtle footprints that might betray their presence to both enemy and traps. Buried devices became nearly invisible, and temperatures often dropped far below what any training could fully prepare them for. Men learned to sense the subtle irregularities in snow and ice, the differences in color, texture, and temperature that hinted at hidden danger. Cold also affected judgment, slowing reflexes and dulling perception, requiring continuous mental recalibration. Survival demanded both technical skill and a high level of physical resilience. Wind added a psychological element. The howl of gusts across open fields or ruined buildings masked faint sounds, complicating detection of both threats and movements. Tools could be blown from hands, dust and debris reduced visibility, and shifting branches created constant auditory distractions. Sappers relied increasingly on tactile sensation, intuition, and pre-established signals, transforming the body into a finely tuned instrument of perception. Even with experience, each gust of wind required recalibration of awareness, strategy, and physical effort. Sun and heat introduced their own hazards. Sun-baked fields or ruins reflected light, creating glare that could obscure devices or traps. Dehydration and fatigue were constant threats, and maintaining focus became increasingly difficult as hours passed. Men learned to ration water, use improvised shades, and adapt movements to minimize exposure, balancing the necessity of speed with the practical limits of human endurance. The sun, which offered visibility, simultaneously amplified danger, heat, and exhaustion. Even in extreme conditions, sappers remained acutely aware of their surroundings. Observation became a continuous exercise, integrating sensory input with experience. Subtle shifts in terrain, slight color changes, and patterns in vegetation were scrutinized for hidden devices. Tools were used with precision, and improvisation remained a constant requirement. Survival was an ongoing negotiation between knowledge, skill, and the unpredictable forces of nature. Despite these challenges, small victories reinforced resilience. A device successfully disarmed in a snow-covered field, a safe path cleared through mud, or a makeshift shelter erected against wind and rain provided immediate relief and psychological reinforcement. Even brief warmth from a fire, the taste of a hot meal, or a shared glance of understanding among comrades became profound reminders of human perseverance and ingenuity. Camaraderie in extreme weather was indispensable. Men monitored each other constantly, checking for frostbite, exhaustion, or dehydration, offering small gestures of support and reassurance. Practical help, tightening clothing, sharing water, or lending gloves, was accompanied by subtle humor and quiet conversation. These interactions strengthened bonds, sustained morale, and reinforced the unspoken reliance that defined sapper life. Adaptation was not only physical but mental. Every operation, every step, and every improvisation reinforced a mindset of vigilance, flexibility, and resourcefulness. Weather conditions magnified the challenges of their already demanding roles, requiring continuous adjustment, awareness, and strategic thinking. The sappers' ability to survive and succeed in such environments was a testament to their skill, discipline, and resilience. Extreme weather highlighted the intricate balance of sapper life: danger, fatigue, improvisation, and vigilance intertwined with skill, camaraderie, and resilience. Every cleared path, every disarmed device, and every navigated obstacle became both a triumph over the elements and a reinforcement of the extraordinary endurance required to operate in a world where nature and war conspired together to test every limit.